Alleluia. Om Mani Padme. Om. Allah.
Welcome. You're watching Harmony and Diversity, and today we're speaking with Vincent Peile. He's a former Catholic priest and now a grief counsellor. Thanks for coming in, Vincent.
Pleasure to be here.
Vincent, I think it would be safe to say that you started life as a Catholic. How did that happen? You were born, and then what happened?
Well, I've got to thank my parents for that. Born a Catholic,
Yes.
Raised a Catholic, went to a Catholic school, was shaped by that in my values and beliefs, which I still hold.
Mm-hmm.
And the Church is still just part of my DNA. My faith is nurtured and nourished by it, and it would be difficult for me to live without that.
Yes.
And that influence of the Church and the mystery of God and a lady definitely came from my mother in particular, who was a convert to Catholicism.
And that conversion, was that solid? Did she hold with her?
Very solid, to the point that when her first boy was killed by a train at the age of 7, she went to the local parish priest after the funeral and said she'd like to donate a statue in his memory, to which the parish priest said no. And then my mother came out with quite a number of unclerical expletives, which relocated the parish priest to a place that certainly wasn't heaven, and took her outside the externals of the Church. But the interior faith that brought her into the Catholic Church remained with her, so that every Friday, without fail, rain, snow, hail, Mum would always get the train from Bomb Beach into St Francis Church to go to the novena and benediction for Our Lady, and to say the Memorare prayer and touch the icon of Our Lady of Perpetual Help, and which has remained to me to this day.
That's quite powerful, quite a powerful background.
And it also presents a very poignant maternal image of the divine mystery.
And from your father's perspective, what was his?
My father, like most men, probably tended to more internalise his faith. He was like most Catholics, you front up, you pay up, and you shut up.
Was he a regular mass attender? Or was
No, both my parents were. And I remember in primary school we had a mission given by 2 Franciscan friars, and they said, if you want something bad enough, pray for it and you'll get it. So, being a fairly naive 6-year-old boy, I took these 2 Franciscan friars at their word, and after 4 years of hard work on my knees, there didn't seem to be much response to my prayer. And then some time later, I was in leaving certificate at that stage in 1967, my father started to come back to the church for Sunday Mass, and then by matriculation, Mum was coming every Sunday.
Right.
Dad would go to Holy Communion, but Mum wouldn't. 12 months after that, after working in the National Bank for a year, I entered Corpus Christi College, Werribee, and Archbishop Knox, who'd arrived in Melbourne after the long reign of Archbishop Daniel Mannix, came down to celebrate the annual family Mass, and that was the first time I saw my mother go to Holy Communion.
Right.
But her expression of the faith had now come more into the sacramental line of Sunday Mass and the Eucharist. Prior to that, and because of the rejection she felt of the humanity of this priest, was simply that, well, me and Our Lady will do it together and I'll get on with it.
Right. And that's sort of set a bit of a mould for yourself. You're very attached to Our Lady to this day, is that
Yes,
right?
yes.
And how does that manifest itself?
Always by saying the Memorare, Hail Marys, thinking of people who I might be praying for during the day. and just offering them up to Our Lady.
Yes, yes. So let's go back to the first year of your seminary. What was life like in a seminary in those days?
It was exciting. I think I may have overdosed on the sound of music at first. This idyllic existence of heaven here on earth, which I soon found out after the first week was going to be a long way off. I encountered 200 rules, 100 other seminarians from first year, known as the rhetorician's year, through to fourth year, basically 4 years of philosophy, 200 rules, a regimented way of life that's basically the formation had been laid down at the Council of Trent.
Right.
So here was I in 1970 living a lifestyle that had been predominantly shaped by the 800 or so bishops that had met for the Council of Trent at Trent in the middle of the 16th century. But 3 years later that was to radically change as a result of the Second Vatican Council, which began in 62 under Pope John the 23rd and finished under the papacy of Paul VI in 1965.
Yeah, that opens an interesting perspective, doesn't it? Because you've got this ancient rules and then you're coming up to this big change. Did that impact you, the Vatican II change?
We'd read so much about Vatican II that we failed to realise that this sleeping giant was basically at the back door. It came about particularly in seminary formation when Archbishop Knox, who'd been in the diplomatic corps, came to Melbourne in 1967, and he proceeded to bring in the changes of the Second Vatican Council with in a fairly fast manner.
Yes.
Corpus Christi College Werribee and Glen Waverley were both closed in 1972. In 1973, Corpus Christi College Clayton opened, and there were 200 students entered there in a new style of seminary formation that was still in Kimby's. It hadn't been tried or tested.
Right.
And so going from 200 rules basically down to just a couple of rules that make sure you attend Mass and go to lectures. And I well remember one cynical old parish priest coming to give a talk to the students and looking at the sanctuary lamp and saying, well, why have you got that? Is it just to light your cigarettes?
There's another rule, and it's called time, and we've run out of it. We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back. You're watching Harmony and Diversity, and we're speaking with Vincent Peile. He's a former Catholic priest and now a grief counsellor. Vincent, when we left, we were talking about this elderly priest who had this comment to make about the sanctuary light.
So I remember this parish priest coming to talk to the students at Clayton. He was a senior priest in the Archdiocese, very much a man's man, and he was brought up in a time and a world that had radically altered since the Second Vatican Council. And while the externals were adopted, the mentality was you keep the rules and the rules will keep you. So to see students in civies having optional times for Mass due to studies, and then looking at the sanctuary lamp and remarking, well, I guess that's only there so students can light their cigarettes. Revealed a tension between the pre-Vatican II clergy and the clergy who were being formed as a result of the requirements of the Second Vatican Council.
And the longer you'd been in the pre-Vatican II clergy model, yes, the longer you'd been there, the worse the effect would have been, I guess.
And often too, that pre-Vatican II model was more about maintenance than mission. Keep the bolts of the local factory running and the plant will run well.
How did that dictum of you keep the rules and the rules will keep you, how did you see that working? There's some little traps in there you could trip over.
Well, it didn't work. That's the strange thing. But you've got to realise that these rules came from higher authority. And also from those who'd obviously kept the rules, because it took them places. So if you're fairly compliant and subservient, and you might have a subliminal career choice in mind, you can go places.
Yes.
But going out as a young curate is, again, another cynical old gentleman said, well, curates are just mice training to be rats, which wasn't saying much about the parish priest.
My goodness. So to say there was tension was pretty much an understatement.
Well, part of the tension was that you were appointed to a parish and to a priest and to live in a presbytery that was totally unknown to you. So you were introduced to this priest you'd never met before, but undoubtedly you'd heard either wonderful things about him or less wonderful things about him, and he would tell you about the parish and the school and what your job was, which was basically to obey him first, and then secondly to go out and knock on doors and celebrate the sacraments, do the baptisms, marriages, funerals. And on one occasion, I lived with a parish priest who I think worked on the principle, wising if you've got a canary. Told me that if I was going to be late for the evening meal, I would break my fast and he would have to say the evening mass. So again, the emphasis was on the rules.
The rules, yes.
And in that same parish, I thought, well, the youth group need a fundraiser. We'll have a Sunday car wash. And after it was all over, the parish priest reminded me that I'd broken the rules of the Sabbath by doing work on the Sabbath. So there was this tension between the pre-Vatican II mentality and the emerging insights and understanding of how does the Church proclaim its gospel in this new age, which had been inaugurated by John the 23rd by calling together the Second Vatican Council. So what was springtime for a younger clergy was something that an older clergy, I think, felt quite challenged by.
Absolutely.
I mean, my first 3 Sundays at celebrating Mass in one parish, I was reminded that I didn't have the ciborium right on top of the corporal, the square piece of linen where the sacred vessels sat. And so that was brought to my attention. And then the second Sunday it came to my attention that I'd left the sanctuary for the sign of peace, which I'd replied to the parish priest, well, Father, I don't have rubber arms. And then as it was Lent, I came out to give Holy Communion as we didn't have special ministers. He said, oh, I've noticed you're wearing a purple stole, and the rules stipulate you must wear a white stole in the administration of the Blessed Sacrament. And I said, well, in that case, Father, would you like me to take the purple stole off from under the chasuble from where I've been saying Mass? So he wandered off a bit perplexed.
This adherence to rules, that didn't encourage lateral thinking in any way, I wouldn't have thought.
Oh, you could have as much lateral thinking as you like, so long as you didn't exercise it.
Yes, of course, that's the difference. In our earlier conversation, you mentioned something about sort of parishioner response as well, I think to do with helping street kids or something. What was that?
In my last parish, there were a number of street kids, and I felt my understanding of the Gospel, the 25th chapter of St. Matthew's Gospel about the hungry and the homeless, I felt a responsibility to try and help these kids. I didn't necessarily understand them, but I felt that the Gospel said I needed to do something to help them. And when it came to my attention that some of the parishioners were saying, well, we're not putting money on the plate because we believe you're giving money to these street kids. And I said, well, how else are they going to eat? But they may be spending the money on drugs and booze and God knows what. And I said, well, how do I know you're not doing that? I said, look, I don't know the disguises of God today. But I said, I don't think I'd like to meet God in the disguise of one of these street people who I'd helped and failed in the call of the gospel. And to remind them that most of the money that I gave came out of my own pocket.
And just talking about coming out of your own pocket, that is not a grand income in any event, is it?
Well, in school chaplaincy, students, particularly secondary students, would say to me, well, why did you become a priest, Father? And I'd say, oh, for the money.
which of course is not the case. So that story is a little bit troubling in a way. Is that indicative of the attitudes of a normal parish members?
I can only speak for myself. I've met some wonderful priests who'd give the shirt off their back. And I've met other clergy who wouldn't give you the steam off their coffee. And again,
steam off your coffee. You usually have coffee when you're in a time break, and we'll go for one right now.
Good idea.
We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back. You're watching Harmony and Diversity. And we're speaking with Vincent Peile. He's a former Catholic priest and a grief counsellor. We were talking about steam off the coffee and generosity. That sort of addressed the priests, but what about the parishioners? That sort of attitude seemed to be a bit narrow in saying you shouldn't be helping your
It was only a small group of people, because I think it's important to realise that in parishes you're dealing with people. And people have different agendas, even in faith, so that power can be an important issue for people in a parish. And some people just like to use that power to find a place and a position in the parish, be it wanted or unwanted.
Right. Where does Jesus fit into that?
Good question. Ultimately, it's expressed sacramentally, prayerfully, in the body of Christ in the local parish church, and ideally lived out in the works of charity and mercy, and more importantly, lived personally in the lives of the individuals who come together. And there are many Catholic parishes and clergy today, for example, that do the most wonderful things in helping people that weren't around when I was a young priest. And the consciousness of young people today in helping people in need, I think is extraordinary. We can be so quick to criticise young people today because of drugs, sex and rock and roll, which is certainly around in my time. But the consciousness of young people today, I think, has a greater awareness about the needs of people, not only here, but as a result that we're now living in a global world and not the village that I grew up in. Exactly.
And in the older days, not the olden days, the older days, there was a lot of either brothers and priests involved in the church activities in the world. That's changed a lot, hasn't it?
It has. Primary schools, up until the middle of the 1950s, most of the educational facilities, universities, hospitals, welfare institutes, caring agencies were staffed, 96% of those facilities were staffed by brothers, priests and nuns.
Right.
Today it's about 0.04%. So from my perspective, what's missing significantly is that particularly our hospital and schools are now sacramentally bankrupt. When I was at school at De La Salle in the 1960s, we had 5 chaplains. You went to confession every first Thursday, you went to Mass every first Friday, the clergy would come in, and it was just a given. But it also laid the foundations down too, that gave you something to hang on to.
Yes.
And that the priest was available, where the parish model today is radically changing because of the decline of vocations to the priesthood and religious life in Australia. And you've only got to look at the number of migrant clergy that are now running parishes in the Australian church, and the number of parishes that are now being amalgamated. In the 80s, I went to Ivanhoe Parish, which consisted of 3 parishes, and there were 5 priests between those 3 parishes. And in my own parish of Mary Immaculate Ivanhoe, we had 6 masses just on Saturday and Sunday.
Good heavens.
I think today they now have about 5 masses overall for those 3 parish communities. And I think there's 1.5 priests there. So to get round to those parish families, sacramental programs, it's just not there.
So it's a lot of the effort is now falling on the laity.
The laity, and in many cases, our faith communities have shifted from the parish into the schools.
Okay.
And so the schools are now becoming the basis of a faith community because of a shortage of vocation, so that big feast days will be celebrated. But the days when I started off at St Mary's Geelong, where you went to a couple of schools several days a week for class masses, retreats, confession, one-to-one interviews, that's now the stuff of history.
So, and this is an unfair question to ask out of the blue, but...
Well, you might get an unfair answer.
Well, thank you. That's fair trade. It seems there's an evolution happening, and there's someone who's
Definitely.
involved in it. Where do you think that's going? Can you anticipate where it might go to?
If I was the Holy Spirit, I could, but even my powers are limited. I think the social upheaval of the 60s and 70s is still impacting on the church. So, for example, one area, the right and role of women in the church and the world, has radically changed across the world. Just even in the political sphere, we've had our first female Prime Minister, we've had women as premiers, we now have women on corporate boards. And yet, strangely enough, in the Australian Catholic Church, the first feminists, if you want to call them that, were these heroic nuns who came out from Ireland. Mary Aitkenhead, who set up the St Vincent public hospital systems that were there for the poor. The Mercy nuns. These were profoundly strong, gutsy, powerful women. You think of Mary MacKillop, who bowed to an excommunication ban by Archbishop Shields of Adelaide and accepted that as just part of her cross. Look at the legacy she's bequeathed to the Australian Catholic Church. And we talk about women's rights today.
Yes.
I think we need to step back in time in the Australian Catholic Church and recognise the profound and powerful influence that many of these women had.
Yes. Yes, that tends to have been buried, doesn't it? And a visit back might satisfy some of the more wild-eyed feminists looking at it at the moment.
And some of these wild-eyed feminists, like Germaine Greer, were actually taught by nuns at the Presentation Convent down at Garden Vale.
That perhaps might explain their wild-eyedness, but in any event, we won't go there. Thanks very much, Vincent.
Look, it's been a pleasure to be here with you.
I'd like to speak to you again, so you'll be back next week?
Certainly.
Thank you very much. We'll be back next week with a further interview with Vincent Peile.
Baha'u'llah, Shanti Om.